From an emotional storyteller's perspective, this is not just a military reveal, it's a daughter's wound carried in silence until grief rips it open. Elise misses holidays, chemo visits, and even her father's final hours because duty owns every part of her life. The cruelest part is that the one man who understood her pride died before he could say it out loud. What makes this story unforgettable is that the recognition comes too late and still changes everything.
My name is Elise Morrow. At my own father's memorial, a Navy SEAL admiral blocked me from the front row, saying it was for military members. While my mother looked on, a 13-year-old lie began to crumble. My family was certain I was the disgrace who had failed basic training. But the truth is, I am a lieutenant commander in an intelligence agency without a name. That was the moment I decided to reclaim my own story. Have you ever been completely misjudged by your family? I would love to hear your story below. Before I continue, please let me know where you are all watching from. And if you have ever had to defend your truth against your family's narrative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about quiet courage. This next part might be difficult to believe. I was raised in Virginia Beach, close to the ocean, in a house that smelled of salt air and my dad's polished boots. He was Master Chief Oliver Morrow, a Navy SEAL for 30 years, and he was gone more than he was home. A military life means you operate on hope, not a fixed calendar. It is waiting to hear his key in the lock and trusting he would always come home. My mother, Sandra, was the anchor that kept our family steady. When my dad was deployed, she did everything. She drove us to school, paid the bills, shopped at the base commissary, and kept our old car from falling apart. She could host a barbecue with a flawless smile, even after being awake for 72 hours, sick with worry about my father. She attended all my school events alone. She taught herself to fix a leaky pipe, patch drywall, and sort through complicated military tax documents. She had a quiet strength that most people never saw. I think carrying that weight alone for so many years made her tough. After decades of needing to be strong, it simply becomes a part of you. My brother, Tyler, is older than me by 4 years. In high school, he was the star football player, on the homecoming court, and a teacher's favorite. His easy confidence made him naturally popular. He attended Virginia Tech on a scholarship for construction and later started his career in Richmond. Tyler was considered the successful one in our family because his life followed a clear path. His journey was simple. He always came home for the holidays, and he called our mom every week. He was the child my mother could boast about, her proof of successful parenting. I, on the other hand, was always on the sidelines. I grew up watching everything from a distance, picking up on all the little details. I enjoyed books written for adults and asked questions that made people uncomfortable. When my father came home from a mission, Tyler would sprint into his arms, and they would immediately start playing catch in the yard. I had a more reserved approach. I would just sit and wait for him on the porch steps. As he approached from his car, I would look for clues in his expression. He would get down on one knee, put his hands on my shoulders and say, "All right, Elise, tell me what is on your mind." I would ask him about his trips, what the sea looked like on a dark night, and if he ever got scared. His replies were never direct, but I could see in his eyes that he appreciated my questions. My dad was not a man who showed his feelings openly. 30 years as a SEAL tends to remove that from a person. However, during those quiet talks on our porch, as I asked the questions no one else would, I saw it. It was a profound, unspoken pride. The kind of pride you find in the silence between words. I wanted to be just like him, but not in the same way as my brother. I was not interested in the man at the cookout, throwing a football, or sharing stories with his buddies. I looked up to the man who could disappear for months and return a different person, the one who carried secret knowledge, the one who woke up at 4 a.m. because his body had forgotten how to be at rest. At 17, I did not understand the true price of that life. I only knew it was the most real part of him, and I wanted that for myself. The summer I graduated from high school, I shared my intentions. We were in his sanctuary, the garage, with the pieces of a truck engine spread across the concrete. His arms were covered in grease. I was sitting on an overturned bucket when I told him, "Dad, I am joining the Navy." He did not look up from his work. He tightened a bolt, put his tool down, and wiped his hands on an old rag. Then he met my eyes and said, "The Navy will take everything from you, and then it will ask for more." He continued, "As long as you know that." I told him I understood. He gave me a single, sharp nod. There was no grin, no argument, and no effort to persuade me otherwise. He just picked up his wrench and went back to what he was doing. Coming from him, that was a blessing. My mother, however, cried for 2 straight days. She had dreamed I would attend college and have a normal life. Tyler said I was just seeking attention. "You are not him," he scoffed one night at the dinner table. "You will never survive the SEALs." I did not bother to answer him. I enlisted the next week, and in August of 2013, I left for boot camp. At 18 years old and 132 pounds, I was completely certain of my choice. Basic training was every bit as difficult as I had been told, but in ways I did not expect. Getting enough sleep was a rare treat, the drill instructors were always yelling, and the physical training was so brutal that men twice my weight were quitting in the first week. For me, though, it was a perfect fit. The strict routine, the endless challenges, and the deep sense of purpose were exactly what I craved. I was the quickest runner and swimmer in my division. I placed second in push-ups, losing only to a woman from Oklahoma who was at least 40 pounds heavier than me. I also scored in the top 3% on all academic tests. About 2 weeks in, my commanding officer, Chief Petty Officer Brennan, pulled me over. He said I had a quality that he rarely saw. He never explained what he meant by that. He just told me to keep my head down and continue to excel. 3 weeks later, at 4 a.m, I was woken up by 2 men in civilian clothes. They wore no uniforms, carried no badges, and held a folder with my name on it. They said I had been chosen for a special assignment and had to leave with them right away. There was no debating it, and no more information was provided. My commanding officers were informed that I had a medical emergency. The rest of my division was told I had quit. My permanent record states, "separated for failure to adapt," and my family was told that I simply gave up. I was taken to a telephone in a sterile, white hallway beneath a humming fluorescent fixture. One of the men stood about 6 feet from me, watching with his arms crossed. I called my parents' house. My mom picked up on the first ring. I told her that I was on my way home. I can still hear the 3 long seconds of quiet that passed before she finally replied, "You have no idea how much your father is going to be disappointed." I wanted so badly to tell her the truth that I was selected, not cut, that my performance had placed me in the top 1% in the nation, and naval intelligence had recruited me for a classified mission. I wanted to shout that this was more important than basic training, more important than the SEALs, and more important than anything she could imagine. But as I took a breath to speak, the man against the wall slowly and firmly shook his head no. That one motion was all it took. "I know, Mom. I am so sorry," was all I managed to say before ending the call. That very short phone call severed my connection with my family for the next 13 years. The story about me quitting the Navy became their unshakable truth. It colored every judgment they had about me. At Thanksgiving, my mother would let out a long sigh and say, "Elise could not even make it through boot camp." If a neighbor asked about me, she would say the military was not a good fit for her. For Tyler, my supposed failure was his favorite punchline. "My sister lasted 3 weeks in the Navy," he would say to others, a smirk hidden behind fake sympathy. "She only made it 3 weeks." Over the years, that lie became my identity in their minds. It was who I was, not just something I did. I was the Morrow who failed, while my brother Tyler was the Morrow who succeeded. That was the official family version of events, and I was powerless to change it. But beneath the surface of that lie, I was building an entirely different life. The intelligence program I was in was incredibly tough. After being pulled from basic training, I spent 14 weeks at a secret location, learning skills I am not allowed to discuss. In my first year, I qualified as an expert in intelligence. I had a talent for languages. I was fluent in Arabic in 6 months and Farsi in 8. By 2015, I was a petty officer, second class, and had been accepted into the Seaman to Admiral program. This was an exclusive naval me commissioned talented enlisted sailors as officers. I earned a bachelor's degree in just 2 years from a military-affiliated university, all while still performing my intelligence work. I received my commission as an ensign in 2017. At the age of 22, I was a commissioned Navy officer, but to my relatives, I was just pushing papers at some dull government job. My next duty station for 2 years was the USS Halsey, a destroyer based in San Diego that operated in the Western Pacific and the Arabian Gulf. My role was leading the ship's intelligence unit, where my daily reports to the captain directed our every move. In just a year and a half, I made lieutenant junior grade. Then, in 2019, a new posting to North Carolina's Joint Special Operations Command changed everything. It was the place where all my training came together. I found myself supporting the most elite units, even the SEAL teams my own father had once served with. My work guided missions on a knife's edge. From the heart of command centers, I watched life-or-death situations play out on screens, witnessing things that must remain a secret forever. By 2020, I had been promoted to lieutenant. My new job sent me to undisclosed locations for assignments I can never describe. I have witnessed things on glowing monitors at 3 a.m. that are burned into my mind forever. But without fail, every Thanksgiving, my mother would say the same thing. This is my daughter who tried the Navy, but it was not a good fit. I never once set her straight. It was impossible. Maintaining my cover was paramount, even if it meant becoming a family punchline. My brother's opinion that I was a failure was meaningless. The intelligence I managed was at the highest level of classification. Revealing the truth could have cost people their lives. Compromising a mission was unthinkable. So, I quietly endured the family's judgment at the holiday table every year. But a single conversation gave me the strength to get through it. It took place on Thanksgiving back in 2019. I had a short 2-day leave between deployments. Relatives were everywhere in the house. My brother, Tyler, was there with his wife and their children. The dining room was packed with aunts and uncles. My mother was in the kitchen, going on about Tyler's latest building contract. She barely acknowledged me, just offering a simple, "Oh, Elise is here. Good." Later that night, I escaped to the garage for a moment of silence. In the darkness, I found myself propped against my father's workbench, the very same spot where I had announced I was enlisting 6 years ago. The old jumble of auto parts had been replaced with orderly tools and a quiet country song on the radio. I could hear the sounds of family laughter drifting from the house. The garage door creaked open, and my dad came in. He did not turn on the light, just rested against the far wall with his arms folded. After a quiet moment, his voice was low. "I have been on the teams long enough to know what a medical discharge looks like, and that is not your story." Tears instantly flooded my eyes. I was completely speechless. I could not confirm or deny what he suggested. I just stood there in the shadows, concentrating on keeping my breath even. He gave me a single, deliberate nod, and in that moment, I knew he understood. As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. Still facing away, he spoke. "I am proud of you, kid, for whatever it is that you are doing." And then he was gone, back to the house. The subject never came up between us again. He never defended me against my mother's jabs. He never shut down Tyler's taunts. He knew my clearance was more important than family perception, that some duties outweigh opinion. That was the final time we ever discussed my job. When he died, my secret was buried with him. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, Tyler's anger festered. His marriage collapsed. His wife took their little girl and moved to Northern Virginia. Tyler was stuck with alimony, a nearly empty apartment, and a business on the brink of failure. His drinking increased, and it seemed he only came to family functions looking for a fight. He channeled all of that frustration in my direction. In his view, I was a living reminder of his own shortcomings. I had a nondescript government job, an unremarkable car, and a humble apartment. I always came to family events alone, childless, and with no apparent ambition. He took to calling me the family mooch, but only when I was not there to hear it. He would say it to our mother, our cousins, and really anyone with an ear. My mother never once stood up to him. In her mind, he was simply stating a fact. I will never forget the Thanksgiving dinner in 2021. I had just completed a 72-hour tour at a command post. We were orchestrating a hostage retrieval mission in West Africa. My team had worked tirelessly to locate 3 American captives. We found their position, the assault team executed the raid, and all 3 were recovered. I drove straight from the base, switching outfits in my car and grabbing a pie from a bakery en route. Tyler was already at the table when I walked in. His eyes went from me to the dessert in my hands, and a small, cynical grin appeared on his face. I bet it is nice to draw a government salary for doing 0 work. My mother responded with a soft chuckle. It was not a malicious sound, more like the noise from someone who has believed a lie for so many years that she has forgotten it can wound someone. I sat and ate my meal, holding a strained smile until I could make a polite exit at 9 o'clock. On the silent trip home, her little laugh haunted me. When I got to my building, I just stayed in the car. The lights were on inside my apartment, but I felt as much on the outside looking in as I did at my mother's table. I felt disconnected from my own existence. I had just been instrumental in saving 3 human beings, but the only memories from that day were my brother's sneer and my mother's complicit chuckle. That night, for the first time, I questioned if the emotional price of my secrecy was too high. Sometime in 2021, I was handpicked for a covert intelligence unit that reported solely to the Director of National Intelligence. The secrecy surrounding it was extreme. I was advanced to lieutenant commander and put in charge of a targeting cell for the country's most essential operations. It was the most meaningful assignment of my career, and I was surrounded by the sharpest people in the field. The transfer was so classified that my former commanding officer was not even notified until my new orders were complete. I was only 26 years old. I possessed a security clearance that was among the highest the government gives out, and my own family thought I answered phones for a living. Then, during 2023, my father's health took a turn for the worse. He was 57 and still on active duty, nearing the end of his mandatory 30-year career. For months, he had been mapping out his future, like a fishing trip with his old crew, but he never seemed to have the stamina. Sandra was the one who saw it first. He slept constantly and had no desire to eat. In October, the Navy hospital doctors ran a series of tests. By November, the news was crushing. He had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, which had advanced too far for any real treatment. The doctors said he had perhaps 6 to 12 months left. My father absorbed the diagnosis with total calm, then told the physician, "That is more of a heads up than some of the guys I served with ever received." Sandra, on the other hand, completely unraveled. Tyler drove down from Richmond and remained for the entire week. The second I heard, I put in for emergency leave, but my request was rejected. I was in the midst of a mission that could not be suspended. The operation was live, and human lives were hanging in the balance. My director offered his condolences, but made it clear the mission had to continue. I was absent for his diagnosis. I missed his first round of treatments. I was not at 3 separate family events. Eventually, Sandra's calls with updates just stopped coming. I received a lone text message from my brother Tyler. All it said was, "Thanks for being a no-show again." I stared at the words on the screen for a solid 10 minutes. Then I turned my phone over and resumed my work. The most agonizing part was that he was right. I had not been present. It was not the choice I would have made. I would have traded anything to be at my father's side. But my responsibility is to protect people who will never know I was there for them. A single week away from my post could lead to others being hurt. My dad would have understood that impossible position. He had been in similar ones for 30 years. My brother and sister could never grasp it, and I was prohibited from telling them why. So I absorbed their rage, the way I had learned to absorb everything, quietly and utterly alone. My father passed on January 14th, 2025, inside the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth. My dad was only 58. For 30 years and 4 months, he had devoted his life to serving the United States Navy. His service earned him a Bronze Star for valor, a pair of Purple Hearts, and the unwavering trust of every single man who served with him. I landed 6 hours too late, arriving from a place I am not allowed to name. I will never be able to reveal where I was or what the mission entailed. The second our aircraft landed in Norfolk, I switched my phone back on. The screen came to life with 17 missed calls. There was no need to check the voicemails. I already understood their content. I drove without stopping to the hospital. Its corridors reeked of antiseptic and scorched coffee. I found my mother standing just outside his door, all alone. I had never seen such a look on her face in my entire life. Her expression was beyond anger, replaced by a profound and weary calm. She offered no words, simply turning to re-enter my father's room and closing the door softly in my face. I stood alone in that corridor for 11 minutes. I counted the 47 ceiling tiles to occupy my mind. A nurse passed twice. The hospital chaplain offered comfort, which I politely refused. When the door reopened, my brother Tyler appeared. He looked right at me, stating flatly, "You missed it," then brushed by me toward the elevators. Inside, my father seemed peaceful, smaller than I recalled, but finally comfortable. His hands were folded over his chest. His sealed trident pin rested on the nightstand. I sat by his bed for 2 silent hours. No tears would come. Holding his hand, I finally said everything I should have years ago. I told him I was still serving, and described my command, my intel team, and the directorate I ran. I talked about missions planned and people brought back safe. I even shared secrets the rules always forbade. Finally, I told him I was sorry. Not for my job, but for missed holidays, ignored calls, and every moment work took priority. Even gone, I felt he heard me. His funeral was scheduled for July, a full 6 months later. His service was to be held at the Naval Station Norfolk Chapel, with full military honors. It was the final tribute my father had earned many times over. His 3 decades as a Navy SEAL involved numerous combat deployments and a vast collection of medals. He built a legacy so great that young SEALs stood taller just hearing his name. That chapel would be full. It would be filled with SEALs in their dress uniforms and officers from every special operations group. Our family and friends would sit in the pews directly behind them. I drove to the base alone that Saturday morning. A heavy, suffocating gray sky smothered Virginia. I wore a plain black dress and only the watch from my father's bedside. I chose deliberately not to wear my uniform, wanting no indication of my rank. My reason was simple. This day belonged to him. I was there not as Lieutenant Commander Morrow, but only as Oliver's daughter. The chapel was nearly full when I arrived. I spotted Sandra and Tyler in the front row with relatives I had not seen in a decade. My Uncle Ray was there, and so was Aunt Patricia. Tyler's former wife was absent, but their daughter, Lily, sat in Sandra's lap. Behind them, the pews were a sea of white uniforms and gold braid. I saw some familiar faces, operators my intelligence had supported, commanders I briefed, and men who ran missions my unit had planned. No one in the chapel knew who I was, just another mourning woman they did not recognize. Standing near the podium was Rear Admiral James McEwen, a Navy 2-star. For the last decade of my father's career, he was his commanding officer. McEwen had promoted my father, sanctioned his final deployment, and came to the hospital 3 separate times. The Admiral was the picture of a naval officer, authoritative, assured, and commanding attention. He was leading the service. I began to walk down the center aisle. my heels clicking in the silence. Sandra noticed me at once. Her body tensed and her expression hardened. She approached Admiral McEwen, who was greeting guests at the front. I watched her talk to him, but being 20 feet away, I could not make out what was said. I found out later precisely what she told him. She said, "That's my daughter. She's not in the service. She washed out of boot camp." The Admiral gave a quick, firm nod in response. It was the kind of motion an officer makes after getting a report and making an instant decision. He then turned away from my mother and walked over to block my path. He stood at least 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with an unmistakable air of command. He put a hand on my upper arm. It was not a gentle touch, but a forceful, restraining grip used to escort someone out. The squeeze was so intense I could feel every one of his fingers pressing into my skin. He looked down at me from his towering height. At 5 feet and 6 inches, I stood a full 8 inches shorter. He spoke loudly, ensuring the first 3 rows could hear him perfectly. "Ma'am, you need to leave this area. It is reserved for military personnel." A complete silence fell over the chapel. It started near the front and rippled toward the back. Within moments, every person had turned to look at us. The entire assembly watched an admiral grip a woman's arm, seemingly ejecting her from her father's own memorial. My brother Tyler studied the floor. My mother sat perfectly still, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, uttering nothing. She remained silent. She did not correct him with, "She is my daughter," or "You're mistaken." Not one word from her. She had told the lie. She had designed this public moment, and now she sat and watched. I did not resist or make a scene. It never occurred to me to announce, "I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy." I just turned and walked back down the aisle, my heels clicking on the floor. 400 pairs of eyes followed me. The SEALs, officers, and my family saw me escorted from my own father's memorial. I kept my head high, my gaze forward, my breathing perfectly controlled. I responded precisely as 13 years of training taught me. I accepted the injustice. At that moment, McEwen's phone buzzed. He took it from his jacket pocket and glanced at the screen. I had taken perhaps 5 more steps toward the doors. He took the call. I was too distant to hear the words, but I saw their impact on him. Looking back over my shoulder, I witnessed a complete change. The color instantly drained from his face, as if a light had been switched off. His entire posture changed. His confident, squared shoulders from 3 seconds before seemed to sag before tightening with new tension. His other hand, the one that held my arm, fell limply to his side. He spoke only 2 words into the receiver. "Yes, sir." After a short silence, he repeated, "I understand, sir." Then he hung up. The person calling was Captain William Driscoll, the commanding officer of Naval Station Norfolk. He had been watching the chapel's security cameras from his office, a standard procedure for major events. He had seen McEwen grab my arm. He had seen my mother point me out, and he knew exactly who I was. My own intelligence division had delivered a security brief to his staff only 6 months earlier. Captain Driscoll was undoubtedly direct. He informed the Admiral of his error and instructed him to correct it immediately. I was halfway down the aisle, my pace even, my face a blank mask. A deep quiet settled on the chapel. It was as if 200 people were all holding their breath. "Lieutenant Commander Morrow." I stopped dead in my tracks. My hand reached out and rested on the smooth wood of a pew, perhaps in the 8th row. I did not turn right away. I let 2 full seconds pass, my hand on the bench, allowing the silence to grow heavier. Then, I turned around deliberately. Every single eye was on me. 200 people, my father's colleagues, his leaders, his team, and his family, were all staring at the woman who had just been told to leave. The Admiral stopped before me, his body snapping to attention. Shoulders back and chin up, he met my gaze. Then, his hand rose in a crisp salute. His voice trembled slightly when he said, "Ma'am, my apologies. The front row is reserved for you." I raised my own hand to return the salute. holding it for a perfect 3 seconds, just as they teach you, just as my father would have. I lowered my arm, but remained silent. Words would have broken the moment. I turned and proceeded to the front. As I went, every uniformed officer started to rise. It began in the second row, with a commander whose silver oak leaf I noticed as he got up. The officers in front of me stood, then the next row did the same. The motion spread, pew by pew. When I finally got to the front, every single uniformed officer was on their feet. The effect was like a ripple spreading across water. My mother's mouth was agape. Her previously clasped hands were now gripping the bench ahead of her. My brother, Tyler, was looking at me now, not at his shoes. It seemed he was genuinely seeing me for the first time. I may have looked like his sister, but he was gazing at a complete stranger. I took my seat, only 2 chairs from Sandra. The room was filled with a profound silence. As everyone stood, a strange sense of peace settled over me. 13 years of proving my worth had just ended. My father, Oliver's memorial service continued. Admiral McEwen went back to the podium. He spoke of Dad's 30 years of service, the teams he commanded, and the missions he oversaw. While his voice was firm, his hands trembled slightly on the lectern. He never said my name again in his speech. He did not have to. Every single person there knew exactly what they had just witnessed. After the service, people gave me firm handshakes and respectful nods. I heard quiet murmurs of, "Ma'am," and "My condolences, Commander." A senior chief came up to me. He was a large, decorated man, his uniform displaying a seal trident and many medals. "Your father spoke of you," he said. He was vague on details, but he was incredibly proud. I nodded slightly and thanked him, keeping my composure until he left. Across the chapel, Sandra was frozen. For 20 minutes, she had stood by the door with Tyler and Aunt Patricia, just staring. Her face showed pure shock, like her entire world had just collapsed. Tyler started to approach me twice, but stopped after a few feet and returned to his mother's side. I decided to skip the reception. It was at Sandra's house, with the catered meal, the lawn chairs, and a photo slideshow of my dad. I just could not face it. It was not anger that stopped me. The feeling was much deeper, something I could not even name. I drove back to my Norfolk apartment, parked in the garage, and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. Inside, I sank to the living room floor. I sat there for 2 hours in the pitch dark. I did not turn on a single light, make any food, or cry. I just rested my back on the sofa, looked into the blackness, and felt the immense pressure of 13 years settle upon me. The day's moments played over and over in my mind. McEwen's hand on my arm, the look of shock on my mother's face, the confusion in Tyler's gaze, the phone call, my perfect salute, and the whole room rising. I thought about my dad. He guarded that secret because the mission was always more important than his own pride. I was not angry or relieved. I felt a profound void, a hollowness I had not experienced since his death. It was like a support beam I had leaned on for 13 years had disintegrated. After 3 days, I called Captain Grace Tanaka. She was the senior intelligence officer who saw my talent and pulled me into her world right after boot camp. I remembered seeing her once in a corridor while I was at a payphone calling my mother. I was about to confess everything, but Grace gave me a slight shake of her head. She became my guide after that day. Grace was the one who got me into JSOC and arranged my move to the Intelligence Directorate. She basically built my entire career path for me. She was also the nearest thing to a mother who actually understood my world. I explained everything about the funeral to her. I described McEwen's action, the call, my salute, Sandra's expression, and Tyler's confusion. She heard the whole account without making a sound. When I finished, a tense quiet stretched between us for 10 or 15 seconds. "Elise, you did the right thing," she said at last. "That story was vital. It protected our operations, and it saved lives. Not just here, but in places your family can't even imagine, for people they don't know. Your father knew that. It was everything to him, A question I had not planned to ask slipped out. Did my dad ever try to reach you? I needed to know from someone besides my family. Grace paused for a second. Once, about 4 years ago, he managed to get the main number for my office, which is very difficult. He left a message. He said, "This is for Captain Tanaka. I don't know what my daughter is doing, but I know it matters. I just wanted somebody in her command to know her father is proud of her." That was it. He disconnected before I could reply. When the call with Grace ended, I did not move. I sat on my bed, phone in my lap, letting her words sink in. My father had called her. He went to all that trouble just to say he was proud. He was not digging for information or trying to expose anything. He just wanted someone in my professional life to know that he respected my work. All those years, I had worried he was embarrassed by me. I thought he secretly believed all the awful things Sandra used to say. His silence had never been about disappointment. I had been wrong for so long. It was pride. He had been proud of me for years. He just could not say it to the people who mattered most. It was not an easy choice. He knew some secrets must be kept. He knew that silence is most painful for the ones you love. At Sandra's house, meanwhile, the tension was suffocating. Tyler paced the living room, completely shaken by the events at the church. He was agitated, his voice trembling. He could not stop picturing the Admiral's hand on my arm, the call, and my words, "Yes, sir." He saw my salute, and the 200 officers on their feet, honoring the woman his mother had labeled a complete failure. Sandra was at the kitchen table, where she had been since returning from the funeral. The catered dishes behind her had not been touched. In the next room, the slideshow of Oliver's life continued, showing pictures of him in uniform, overseas, and with his men. She heard the soft click of each photo changing, but she stared blankly ahead. Tyler paused in the kitchen entrance. "How?" was all he could manage to say. "How does a person who supposedly washed out of boot camp earn a salute from a 2-star admiral? I need to know." Sandra kept her head down. Her hands were flat on the table, fingers spread apart. "I don't know," she answered, but Tyler persisted. "So she lied to us for 13 years? At last, Sandra raised her head. Her eyes were swollen, but she was out of tears. She was calm now. She answered softly, "Or maybe we were the ones who were wrong for 13 years. I heard nothing from them right away, which I expected. The memorial had shattered the narrative our family clung to for a decade. They were just beginning to pick through the pieces. I got it. I had 13 years to live with the reality. They had just 90 minutes. Sandra called me 3 times over the next 2 days. I saw her name pop up, but ignored the calls. I was not angry. I just lacked the strength to detail a 13-year secret life on the phone, especially to her. In the same kitchen she once called me a disgrace. I sent one brief text. "I am fine. I need some time." Tyler later said she looked at that text for an entire hour. Then my brother did something I never would have predicted. 5 days after the service, he drove to Naval Station Norfolk. He parked in the visitors area, went to the public affairs office, and informed the sailor there that he was Elise Morrow's brother and needed to know about her role in the Navy. The petty officer, a young woman around 23, looked him over before making a call. Tyler just waited. He told me he stood at that counter for close to 10 minutes, feeling increasingly silly as she murmured into the phone. A door opened abruptly and 2 men in civilian clothes emerged. They were courteous and professional, showing him credentials from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They explained that details on personnel with secret clearances were not public information and that his inquiry was now on record. Then they escorted him off the naval station. Standing in the parking lot, Tyler called Sandra with a shaken voice. "Mom, they just walked me off the base. 2 agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. All because I asked about my own sister." Sandra was silent for a few seconds. Tyler continued. "What is she involved in? What is her actual job?" Sandra replied, "I have no idea, but it is obviously far more serious than we imagined." Tyler did not realize it, but his trip to the base spoke volumes. Federal agents do not remove someone from a military installation for asking about a desk worker. That only happens when the subject of the question is in a role so secret the title itself is classified. The next week, I had a meeting with Grace Tanaka. Her office was a tiny, windowless space on the third floor of a building that does not officially exist. I finally told Grace that I could not continue living with the deception. I was not talking about my official cover, as I would never jeopardize a mission or put my team in harm's way. But I was through with letting my family's mistaken perception of me define who I was. I was tired of enduring holiday meals and listening to their jokes about my supposed failures. I was no longer willing to be the family punchline. Grace was entirely understanding. She had seen this happen before with intelligence agents whose fake identities started to consume their real lives. She clarified that the Navy would not be declassifying my operations. The details of my position, my directorate, the targeting division, and my assignments would all remain secret. However, there were certain things I was now permitted to disclose. My actual rank, my officer's commission, my continuous years of service, and the fact that I was a naval officer. I had joined the Navy at 18, and the simple truth was, I never left. My specific assignments had to remain confidential. But the greater truth, the one my family had misunderstood for 13 long years, was something I could finally share. I resolved to tell them, but it would be on my own terms and on my own schedule. It would not be a confession forced by the funeral, or because Sandra and Tyler were pressing for information. It would be because I had earned the right to be recognized for the person I actually was. That evening, I walked over to my closet. My dress white uniform was hanging at the very back, perfectly pressed and clean, still in its plastic wrap from a classified briefing 7 months earlier. It had 2.5 gold stripes on each sleeve, signifying the rank of a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. My family had never laid eyes on me in this uniform, not even one time in 13 years. My fingers grazed the uniform's sleeve, feeling the profound significance woven into those stripes. They represented all the training, the missions, the operations, and the hidden sacrifices. They were every phone call I missed, every holiday I could not attend, and every silent meal I sat through with my family. I zipped the uniform back inside its garment bag, leaving the closet door slightly open. 3 weeks following the service, a change was in the air, a transformation I could feel from a great distance. Sandra was beginning to break apart, not with loud, dramatic cracks, but with the quiet disintegration that occurs when a fundamental belief is destroyed. She began to review years of her own comments. Every Thanksgiving she informed guests I simply could not get away. She remembered each conversation with a neighbor where she dismissed my efforts with, well, she gave the service a shot. It just was not meant to be. She recalled every instance she boasted about Tyler's new construction project, then looked at me with a blend of pity and disapproval. From a spare room closet, she retrieved old photo albums. She laid them out on the dining table, examining them one after another. Thanksgiving 2014, Christmas 2016, the 4th of July 2018. And there it was, the quality that had been there all this time, my steady self-control. The deliberate way I responded to questions about my job, specific enough to sound ordinary but vague enough to say nothing. The manner in which I would redirect inquiries rather than deny them. It was the quiet confidence of someone trained to protect secrets in a room full of curious people. That discipline had been present the entire time, in every picture, at each family function, and during every discussion. She had just never been interested enough to notice. She called her friend Deborah, a woman who had been a Navy wife for 40 years to a husband who retired with the rank of captain. Deborah had experienced a great deal in her years as a military spouse. She was familiar with the world Sandra was only now beginning to see. Sandra explained everything to her. The funeral, McIvan's, the call, the formal salute, and the stoic officers. Deborah listened to her without interruption. Then she spoke. Sandra, individuals in that profession cannot tell you a thing. That is the entire purpose. The cover is not a lie, it is a shield, Sandra responded. But for 13 years, Deborah interrupted her, she was not deceiving you. She was shielding you. There is a massive difference, and your inability to see that does not alter the facts. Sandra hung up and sat at her kitchen table, her hands clasped together. A different version of reality was forming in her mind, one that would take months to be fully processed. Her daughter had not failed out of the Navy. She had gone further into it than Sandra could ever have conceived. And the silence, all of those quiet family gatherings, had not been a sign of failure. It was a sign of discipline. Tyler was also changing. His meeting with the investigators had disturbed him deeply. For years he had ridiculed me, completely confident in his assessment. And now that confidence had been utterly shattered. One night, he sat in his truck outside his apartment in Richmond, with the engine off and the windows up. He thought about every time he had called me a parasite, every sarcastic holiday comment, and every eye roll when I mentioned I could not discuss my work. He took out his phone and wrote 2 simple words, "I am sorry." He looked at the message for a full 5 minutes before he sent it. I was sitting at my desk when his text appeared. I read it, leaned back, and typed 2 words in response. I know. Tyler stared at my reply for a long while. Just those words. No punctuation, no emoji, nothing like it is okay or no problem. Simply, I know. I believe he was seeking forgiveness. Instead, he received an acknowledgement. And I suspect he eventually realized that the acknowledgement was a far more genuine reply than forgiveness ever could have been. Information started to spread around the Navy community in Virginia Beach. Military installations are like little towns, and the SEAL community is an even more close-knit group. Oliver Merrow's old teammates, the men he had gone on deployments with, trained with, and who had been his pallbearers at his retirement, started contacting Sandra. They did not phone to criticize or disgrace her, but to give her some much-needed context. A retired senior chief by the name of Pete Garza came by her house one afternoon. Pete was 61, built like a fire plug, with hands that looked as if they could grind stone to dust. He served with my father for 15 years, a period that covered 3 deployments, 2 of which create a friendship that never fades. Sandra welcomed him inside. She brewed a pot of coffee. Pete sat at the kitchen table, the very one where Sandra had been trying for weeks to figure out her own child. He then told a story she had never been told. He began, "Oliver called me about 4 years ago, late one night. He had a few beers in him, not many, but enough to make him talkative. He said to me, 'Pete, my girl is involved in stuff I am not supposed to know, and I have never been more proud.' I asked him what he was referring to. He simply replied, 'I cannot say. I just had to tell someone who would understand.' And that was how the call ended. At that moment, Sandra completely fell apart. She started to weep with a raw power I imagined she had not experienced since the day my father passed away. It was a profound, agonizing cry that came from her deepest self, from the place where a person stores their most significant regrets. She had just found out from a man who knew her husband for 15 years that Oliver had been aware the whole time. He knew I had not failed. He knew I was engaged in something of immense importance, and he had kept that from her, not due to a lack of faith in her, but because his allegiance to that world was unconditional. That evening, Sandra sat by herself, holding Oliver's trident pin. She rolled it between her fingers, feeling the outline of the eagle, the trident, the anchor, and the pistol. It was the symbol that had defined her husband. And she finally realized that her husband and her daughter were members of a world she would never be permitted to enter. I received a text from Sandra on a Saturday morning in late August. It was brief and straightforward. "The Lighthouse Diner, Saturday. Just you and me, please." That diner was a little establishment on Shore Drive where my father used to bring Tyler and me on Sundays after church when we were young. I could still envision the tacky vinyl booths, the well-used laminated menus, and a waitress called June. She referred to everyone as Han, and would top off your coffee cup before you even had a chance to ask. It had been quite some time since I had last been inside that diner. I looked at her text message for a full day before responding. I had no idea what this meeting was about. Was it an ambush, a plea for forgiveness, a confrontation, or a scolding? On Sunday morning, I simply wrote back okay and sent it before I could have second thoughts. That Saturday, I went to the diner. I parked my car in the gravel area behind the building and stayed there for 3 entire minutes, just staring at the main entrance. I mentally rehearsed a dozen different opening statements. In some of them, I was composed and businesslike. In others, I unleashed 13 years of suppressed feelings, the kind of bitter truths that are liberating to voice, but devastating to hear. Ultimately, I never had the chance to use any of my prepared remarks. Sandra was already sitting in a booth when I entered. She was holding an old white coffee mug, with its diner logo worn almost completely away. Her eyes were red and puffy, not from crying recently, but from the kind of ingrained redness that remains for weeks after the tears have dried. She seemed so much smaller than I remembered, looking frail and aged. Her tiredness was deeper than just missing a night of sleep. It was the kind of weariness from a lie held for so long that it finally broke her. She was the first to speak. She ignored all the small talk I had rehearsed about my work, about McKeevan's, the salute, or the call. Her words went straight for the heart. "For 13 years, she began, I let everyone believe you were a failure, and you never said a word against it." I was speechless. This was my mother, the rock, who held our family together during Dad's 30 years in the service. She could fix a leaky pipe, repair a car, and manage every dollar. But she had turned all that power on me. I was not allowed to, I managed to whisper back. She shut her eyes for what felt like a long time. When she looked at me again, she went on. "Your father tried to tell me, not with words. He would just look at me a certain way when I talked about you, as if he knew I was getting it all wrong. He wanted to stick up for you, but his oath stopped him, and I ignored it every single time." I stretched my hand over the table, covering hers. Her hand felt cool from the coffee cup. We sat in silence. The waitress, June, approached with more coffee, sized up our situation with an expert eye, and just kept walking. Finally, Sandra asked, "Can you tell me anything at all?" So I started to share what I could. I told her I was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I explained I had been serving continuously since I was 18 years old, without ever quitting. I let her know my work was classified, so I could not give her details. I tried to convey that every holiday I missed and every call I did not answer hurt me deeply, for reasons I was forbidden to explain. She seemed to be taking it all in, slowly nodding. Then she asked the single most important question. "Are you safe?" Her words stopped me cold. I saw flashes of command posts late at night, computer screens glowing at 3 a.m., and missions in dangerous places. "Most of the time," I said, telling the truth. A short, sudden laugh came from Sandra. It was a sound I recognized, a mix of relief and pain. It was the same laugh my dad had. We both heard it, but neither of us mentioned it. She did not need all the specifics. Just enough of the truth to replace the wrong story she had believed for so long, and after 13 years I could finally give her that. We left the diner together. In the parking lot, the Virginia Beach sun was bright, reflecting off the cars. As we stood near my car, Sandra did something I had not seen her do since I was a little girl. She linked her arm with mine. It was not a hug, just a simple, comfortable gesture that felt right. She held it there for a second before walking to her car. I watched her pull away from my own vehicle. The air smelled of gravel dust, salty sea air, and coffee from the diner. A feeling I had not known for a long time washed over me. It was not forgiveness or even relief. It was quieter, like the start of a new chapter. Over the next 6 months, our relationship transformed. It was not flawless, but it was a fresh start. Sandra and I began having weekly phone calls. In the beginning, our talks were short, just about the weather or what she was making for dinner. Over time, the calls got longer. She would ask about my place, my meals, and other small details. She never pushed for information about my job, and that meant the world to me. Even Tyler drove down to apologize. He came from Richmond on a weekend and found me at Mom's place. He looked me right in the eye and said, "I have been a terrible brother. I do not know how to fix it, but I want to." I told him that was all I ever wanted. And then, for the first time in over 5 years, he gave me a hug. It was an awkward hug, a little too tight and a little too long, but it was exactly what I needed. At Thanksgiving in 2025, for the first time in 3 years, nobody made jokes about my career. When a cousin asked what I did, Tyler stepped in. "She cannot talk about it," he stated. His voice was serious, with no hint of a joke. It held a real respect I had never heard from him before. Later, Mom introduced me to a new neighbor. She said, "This is my daughter, Elise. She is in the Navy." Her voice was clear and proud, with no apologies. I had waited 13 years to hear her say those words. That next January, I got a new assignment overseas. It was a major step in my career, a 2-year deployment to manage operations from a secret location. It would be my toughest job yet, but I was ready. I called Sandra to tell her. For about 15 seconds, she was completely silent on the other end of the line. I could just hear her breathing. Then she said, quietly, "Just come home when you can. I will leave a light on for you." My throat tightened as I listened. Those were the exact words our dad, Oliver, always used. He would say that to Sandra in the driveway each time he deployed. In 13 years, she had never said it to me. The words had always belonged to him. Now, she was giving his promise to me. "I will, Mom," I replied, meaning it completely. The night before I left, I knew it was time to read the letter that arrived with my father's things. The Navy had sent a box in January with his trident pin, a folded flag, and a single page filled with his familiar handwriting. In the 7 months after his death, I had moved the box twice. I had even opened the latch on 3 separate occasions, just to look inside, but I always avoided the note. I just was not ready to read it. But tonight was different. I sat on the bed in my bare apartment. My luggage was packed, and my alarm was set for 4 a.m. I unfolded the paper carefully. It was a sheet from a yellow legal pad. His handwriting was shaky from the medicine he was taking. The date was December 27th, 2024, just 3 weeks before he passed away. It began, "Elise, I never told your mother the truth. That failure is on me, not you. I should have defended you. I should have spoken up every time she put you down. But I did not, and I am truly sorry. You are what I am most proud of, Elise. More than your brother, more than my own service, you are my legacy. I love you, kid. Dad." I read it all again, then clutched the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. I remained that way until the alarm sounded. I do not think I slept at all. I tucked the note into my uniform, zipped my bag, and turned out the light. I drove to the base before the sun came up. That was a full year ago. Today, I am posted abroad, doing the job I was always meant to do. My work is intense, with 16-hour days and meetings that begin before sunrise. The decisions I make have consequences that can never be discussed, and I excel at it. Here, people know me for what I can do. My coworkers treat me with respect. I do not have to pretend to be someone else or hide my skills. This is where I can be my true self. My mother and I have a video call each Sunday. She always asks about the weather and if I am getting enough sleep. She knows not to ask about my work, so she tells me about her garden instead. She is planting tomatoes again, which she had not done since Dad died. She gives me updates on my niece's softball team and the new neighbors who moved in. These are the small things she used to share only with Tyler, thinking I was not interested, but I always was. Sandra has also started volunteering at the Fleet and Family Support Center. She helps other military spouses handle the stress of deployments. She told me about helping a 23-year-old woman who was upset because her husband just shipped out for the first time. Sandra held the young woman's hand and told her, "Be proud of them, even when you cannot understand what they do." Now, she wears a new photo of me on her volunteer ID. In the photo, I am standing in front of an unknown building, wearing the uniform she finally understands. Tyler also sends me real letters these days. He writes about his life, about his daughter Lily playing shortstop, or a building project in Chesterfield County. He has stopped saying he is sorry in his letters. We are past that now. My brother and I are creating a real bond. I feel like I have a brother for the first time. The end of his last letter really got to me. He wrote, "I told Lily about you. I said her aunt has a secret and important job for our country. She asked if you were a superhero. I told her you are." Reading that in my room at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday brought a smile to my face. My eyes started to burn. It was probably the kindest thing he has ever said to me. When I finished work tonight, I walked out into the thick, warm air that clings to your skin. Have you ever been totally misunderstood by your own family? For 13 years, they saw me as a failure, the one who could not get her life together. They were completely wrong. I can still see the exact moment everything changed. It was in a chapel, with a man named McEwen. He was holding my arm, full of the confidence that comes with power. I can see my mother's shocked face, my brother Tyler's shoes on the floor, and then the phone rang. In just 2 seconds, I watched every bit of his patronizing look disappear. He snapped to attention with a salute so sharp it seemed to crack the air, the kind meant for a commanding officer he had just terribly misjudged. Then, one after another, every single officer in the room got to their feet. My mother simply watched, the entire image she had of me crumbling before her eyes. I also remember Sandra in the coffee shop, her cup cold, admitting, "I let everyone believe you were a failure." Her tone was factual, not remorseful. I recall Tyler's brief text, "I am sorry," and my own answer, "I know." The shortest phrases often carry the most meaning. I think back to a Thanksgiving when Sandra announced, "She is in the Navy now." My brother Tyler added instantly, "And we are not discussing it." On that day, all the usual family jokes and stories just stopped. I can still picture my father in his garage, surrounded by car parts. He had told me, "The service will demand everything you have." He was completely right. The cost was enormous. I gave up holidays, family meals, my reputation, my mother's approval, and my brother's trust. For 13 years, I was the family letdown. It took all of my strength, but it gave me something back. It gave me a purpose. My job had true significance. I was with colleagues who understood the high stakes and respected my work. I was absolutely certain that my secret job, one my family could never imagine, was keeping people safe. Real people returned home to their families because of a vital decision my team made at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. My dad spent 30 years protecting people he did not know. I did the same thing for 13 years. The job itself was not the hard part. The true challenge was watching my family believe I was a loser and silently enduring their misguided pity. That was a mission I was never trained for. It was like an assignment with no end date, and it almost broke me. Things are better now. They have a small window into my world. They will never know the specifics, of course. The operations, the objectives, the secret codes, or the awful things I have witnessed on screens are not for them to carry. But now they understand what is important. My mother knows I serve. My brother knows my work is meaningful. And my father, he knew from the very start. I can feel his letter in my hand. The paper is soft and worn from all the nights I clutched it, when the pressure felt crushing and home was a world away. "You are the best part of me." Only 5 words, written in a shaky hand just 3 weeks before my father passed away. That one simple sentence uncovered a truth that was buried under 13 years of being misunderstood. I take in the mild night air, the the stars feel close enough to touch. I know that an ocean away, my mom is leaving a light on for me. For the first time in what feels like forever, it seems I am finally on the right course. If this story connects with you, if you have ever felt unseen by your own family, please keep moving forward. The people who matter will see your true worth. You do not have to carry the burden of their opinions. If this story resonated with you, I would be grateful if you subscribed. I am looking forward to our next story together.